Madam Speaker, I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Madam, the Terrorism, Suppression of Financing Act, or TSOFA for short, was introduced in 2002 to counter terrorism financing in Singapore. It gives effect to the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. It also gives effect to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373 of 2001, which calls on states to work together to prevent and suppress acts of terrorism, including terrorism financing. Over the past decade, we have stepped up capabilities to counter the terrorist threat and taken swift action against terrorist groups such as the Jama'ah Islamiyah and its members. Nevertheless, the threat of terrorism continues to be our top security concern. At the global level, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates have exploited the instability in parts of the Middle East and North Africa in the wake of the Arab Spring to extend their operations and establish safe havens. Within the region, JI and other groups have remained resilient and continue to regroup and plot attacks. Since March 2012, Indonesian police have arrested and killed more than 30 terrorist suspects and disrupted several plots against tourists and diplomatic missions. In July this year, Malaysia also indicated that it had identified at least 15 terror operatives who were recruited in Malaysia to fight in faraway conflict zones, including Syria. Madam, a robust regime to counter terrorism financing is crucial to our fight against the terrorist threat. In addition, given Singapore's status as a major financial center in the Asia-Pacific region, we must protect the integrity of our banking and financial system and prevent it from being abused by persons seeking to fund terrorist activities. This requires us to remain vigilant and to have effective measures to identify and cut off the sources of funding that fuel terrorist operations and networks. This amendment bill seeks to strengthen our counter-terrorism financing regime and enhance our ability to combat terrorism. Cooperation across nations is essential in countering terrorism financing, given that the movement of funds across borders can be conducted with increasing ease. As a member of the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, Singapore is fully committed towards international efforts to counter terrorism financing. The FATF sets standards of how countries should criminalize and act against terrorism financing, as well as cooperate to deny terrorists access to funds and other assets. The amendments proposed in this bill will further align our counter-terrorism financing regime with the FATF standards. Madam, let me now elaborate on the key amendments. The TSOFA currently makes it an offence to provide or collect property for terrorist acts, provide property and services for terrorist purposes, use or possess property for terrorist purposes, or deal with property of terrorists. Clause 3 of the bill increases the financial penalties for terrorism financing offences to enhance the deterrent effect. The maximum fine for these offences will be raised from $100,000 to $500,000 for individuals and $1 million for entities. This will be in line with the maximum fines for money laundering offences under sections 46 and 47 of the Corruption, Drug Trafficking and Other Serious Crimes Confiscation of Benefits Act, or CDSA. The maximum imprisonment term for terrorism financing offences will remain unchanged at 10 years. Due to the serious nature of terrorism financing offences, there must be sufficient deterrence against acts that seek to undermine investigations into terrorism financing offences. Clause 6 of the bill introduces a new section 10B, which will make it an offence to disclose information that is likely to prejudice an investigation of a terrorism financing offence under the Act. The proposed tipping off provision is similar to section 48 of the CDSA, which criminalizes tipping off in respect of money laundering offences. the penalty of a fine not exceeding $30,000 or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years, or both, takes reference from the CDSA. Currently, Sections 8 to 10 of the Act require persons with information concerning terrorist property, transactions relating to such property, or any terrorism financing offense to disclose the information to the relevant authorities. Clause 6 of the bill introduces a new Section 10A to protect the identity of informers against disclosure and discovery during legal proceedings. Similar provisions are currently provided for in other legislation, such as the CDSA, Misuse of Drugs Act, and Prevention of Corruption Act to protect informers. Madam, even as we strengthen our laws to fight terrorism, we must also find ways to rehabilitate and reintegrate terrorist detainees and former detainees. While the Act prohibits dealing in property, including funds of terrorists, Section 7 allows the Minister for Home Affairs to grant exemptions from the prohibition. Currently, exemptions are granted for transactions relating to basic expenses, in line with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1452 of 2002. Such basic expenses would include payment for foodstuff, rent or mortgage, medicines and medical treatment, taxes, insurance premium, and public utility charges. Clause 4 of the bill refines the exemption provision under Section 7 to facilitate the use of funds by terrorists and their families to meet their basic expenditure needs more adequately. The refinements are in two areas. First, the bill broadens the scope for exemption. Currently, Section 7 provides for the Minister to make exemptions only for the offense of dealing with property, but not for providing property and services. This means that even if the Minister has, for example, granted an exemption to allow the purchase of an HDB flat, the bank is prohibited from providing a bank loan to finance the purchase of the flat. Under the new Section 7, the Minister may make exemptions to permit the provision of property and services, including financial services like loans. I want to assure the House that this exemption will only be invoked to cover cases where the provision of such property or financial services would support the subsistence or rehabilitation of a terrorist, as well as the subsistence of his family. The exemptions granted under the new Section 7 will not extend to the provision of property and services for terrorist purposes. Second, the bill streamlines the process for granting exemptions for transactions relating to basic expenses. Currently, the Minister makes a separate exemption order for each transaction that is for the purpose of meeting basic expenses. To streamline the process, a general exemption order will be made by the Minister upfront, with the definition of basic expenses stipulated in the order, to automatically exempt transaction undertaken to meet stipulated basic expenses. The definitions of basic expenses would be consistent with that in the UN Security Council Resolution 1452 of 2002, which allows funds and resources for such expenses to be exempted from financial sanctions. To maintain control and oversight of these exempted transactions and monitor the use of the proceeds, the new subsection 3 provides for the Minister to require that a person must first obtain a notice of exemption before the general exemption order can apply to him. The notice of exemption may be obtained from the Minister or a public officer authorized by him. Finally, Madam, the bill makes amendments for the consolidation of identical terrorism financing provisions across different pieces of legislation. At present, Singapore's legislative regime for countering terrorism financing consists of the TSOFA, as well as the United Nations Anti-Terrorism Measures Regulations and the Monetary Authority of Singapore Anti-Terrorism Measures Regulations. To streamline the legislative framework and increase administrative efficiency, the overlapping terrorism financing provisions in the UN regulations and MAS regulations will be consolidated under the TSOFA. Madam Speaker, the terrorist threat continues to be a real one. To prevent a terrorist attack on Singapore, we have adopted a holistic strategy that not only seeks to harden Singapore against attacks through robust security measures, but also emphasizes upstream preventive measures. This includes working with religious and community leaders to educate Singaporeans against extreme ideologies and to rehabilitate and reintegrate terrorists back into society. The proposed amendments will boost our fight against terrorism by strengthening our counter-terrorism financing regime and support our terrorist rehabilitation efforts. Terrorism is an international threat supported by a global network of terrorism financing operations. This requires close international coordination supported by international bodies such as the FATF. The proposed legislative amendments are in line with international practices and FATF standards and will enhance the government's effectiveness in countering terrorism financing. Madam Speaker, I beg to move.